Thank you for coming. Thanks to Steve for helping arrange this. I'm indebted to him. He said religion is a hallucination. Well, he's not wrong, necessarily. But then neither is hallucination wrong if it's biology. So I think it's, what's the principle? If A equals B and B equals C? So if religion has hallucinations and biology has hallucinations, religion has biology, I don't know where it's going. We'll just figure it out as we go. Okay, so I call it hallucinations because after I put this together, I thought, there is some biology in here, but there's also a lot of stuff that's not biology. So we don't have to overcommit ourselves to what's actually happening here. So the first thing is to decide how we're going to approach this question. So biologically, in any case, there are clearly neurological brain lesions that are disease states that cause hallucinations. But there are also hallucinations without diagnosed mental illness. And ultimately what that means is normal people have hallucinations. There's nothing wrong with them. Neurological events resulting in religious experience. That's what you guys are interested in. So this talk, we're going to sort of start out with just some boring stuff about hallucinations that happen because of brain diseases. But you're really here to hear more about the consequences further down the road, which we'll get to eventually. And ultimately, hallucinations are created intentionally by humans. Of course, we're familiar with the use of psychedelics, which are now called entheogens. That's the new science word, I guess. Any psychoactive substance that induces a spiritual experience. So entheogen is specifically a drug that you take to get that spiritual experience, whereas psychedelics don't necessarily imply a spiritual experience, although they can. So psychotropics, entheogens. Another way that you get hallucinations, especially under ritual conditions, but other conditions as well, is through deprivations. So people do this intentionally in ritual. They sleep deprived, or they, through exhaustion, like the Muslim Sufis who twirl for hours, or even in our own culture, raves. People who will dance and do this for hours and hours on end. They can get to have what we'll call an altered state of consciousness, which we'll talk about later. All right, so what's a definition of a hallucination? How's that look? Is that moving on you? Yeah. Is that a hallucination? Because it's not. So the definition of a hallucination is a sensory perception of non-existing or absent events or causes. So we know that thing's not moving, right? Yet you perceive that it is. Is that a hallucination? Well, according to this definition, kind of is. So you might want to check in, All right. And as I alluded to, hallucinations frequently occur during altered states of consciousness. Altered states of consciousness, it's a concept that's broader in scope than hallucinations, but includes misrepresentation of sensory perceptions as well as cognitive inhibition of the self and inhibition of the sense of personal boundaries. So I'm sort of broadening the scope, but altered states of consciousness is an important aspect of the human experience. So I had to bring that in. So what's an example of common hallucinations? Hearing voices. It's a symptom of schizophrenia. Not all schizophrenic hear voices. Not all people hear voices who have schizophrenia. But it's the inability to distinguish between the inner and outer voice. And so here it says, hearing voices doesn't always mean schizophrenia, and about 3% without diagnosed mental illness claim to hear voices. Other reasons that you can perhaps hear voices under duress is bereavement. But again, just like we talked about altered states of consciousness, any kind of stress can cause, under the right circumstances, kinds of hallucinations, and we'll certainly look at other examples. music hallucinations activate the same brain regions as actually listening to music. So, and this is a kind of a critical thing that will come up. This theme will come up over and over again, that when we have hallucinations, it's working through the same brain regions that would cause the normal sensory experience. So hearing voices, it says the inability to distinguish between the inner and outer voice. So the outer voice, the perception that someone out there is talking, is still using the same brain region as if you were actually hearing someone talk to you. Should we have questions or should we wait till the end? Does it matter?
It's up to you.
All right, go ahead. Let's see what happens.
People who are not diagnosed as schizophrenic but still hear voices, are they considered non-mentally ill?
Yes.
Or they have another type of mental illness?
No. Well, I mean, there can be other reasons. I mean, this is just one example. There's all kinds of reasons you might hear voices, other pathological reasons, but there are certainly people who have no pathology who hear voices. And the point I want to make about that is, well, I will say advisedly, you all have that experience. I certainly have had the experience. I will say not frequently, but once in a while you think you hear something, your name or something being said to you, and no, there's no one there. And presumably your brain created it. Could there have been a noise out there that sort of sounded like someone talking to you? Well, maybe, but you know, it turns out that we all probably have little mini hallucinations along the way. Causes are poorly understood of how hallucinations use the same brain regions. Why does that happen? There's a lot of research being done and needs to continue to be done to understand how something causes that brain region to act as if there was in fact a stimulus when there wasn't. And it, again, depends on the type of hallucination. It depends on the type of if there's any kind of brain damage or anything like that. So I'm going to read, one more thing before I read. Ultimately, it's an abnormal activation of the auditory cortex. You can have hearing loss, tinnitus. So these are actually, to answer that question, there are specific reasons that we sometimes know that can cause people to have auditory hallucinations. Hearing loss and tinnitus are a couple examples, but there's certainly plenty of examples where we don't know why that happens. And again, this is another theme that comes up. When a sensory modality like hearing, sight, even smell and taste, if you lose those, the brain tends to have the habit of still wanting to have that experience, that sensory experience, and it creates it. And it creates the hallucination. So this is just one example. We'll see more examples. So I'm going to be reading a number of quotes of people who have a particular hallucinatory experience and their attestation of what was happening. So this is from a person who does not have a diagnosed mental condition who hears voices, one of the 3%. It seems to me that these conversations are real and are actually taking place between real people at the very time I'm having them, but are occurring somewhere else. I can't think of any way to regard these experiences except as hallucinations. I am never a participant. I am never addressed. I am just listening. Well, that's a very rational explanation. You kind of think, that guy's not crazy. For that reason, anyway. And then under duress. So there's a movie about a guy who falls into a glacier and breaks his leg. I think it's called something about Into the Void or something. And I don't even know if this quote comes from that, but this is a person who had this, he was a climber who broke his leg falling off an ice ledge into a deep crevasse. So I'm thinking it might be this guy. He said, "The voice was always right, and I listened to it when it spoke and acted on its decisions. The voice urged me into motion. It didn't seem to concern me that I was moving like a snail. So long as I obeyed the voice, then I would be all right." And we could certainly say, you know, we all have an inner voice. So why is this guy's inner voice any different? Or maybe it was his inner voice, but he's treating it, he's telling us that it seemed to him to be an outer voice. It was probably his inner voice. That's what we would think, except that his perception of it was different. And of course, he's in a situation where he's broken his leg, he's fearing for his life, he's probably hungry and thirsty, and he's stressed out to the max. So, just an example. Visual hallucinations. Blindness can lead to visual hallucinations. Another example where the loss of the sensory modality can cause these hallucinations, and it's called Charles Bonnet syndrome. But it can also happen from occipital or temporal lesions or strokes. So the occipital lobe in the rear of the brain is where the visual imagery is processed. So the light goes in the eye, the optic nerve carries it to the rear, to the occipital area, and that's where the various visual neurons process it. And so if you have damage to that area, or the temporal lesion, or a stroke, which obviously will destroy part of your brain, it can cause visual hallucinations. With loss of visual inputs, visual cortex seems to want to generate output. It's similar to the phantom limb syndrome. You've all heard of the phantom limb syndrome. There's a book by V.S. Ramachandran, The Phantoms of the Brain, neuroscientist in San Diego. And that's one of the chapters is he talks about how people lose an arm and they feel pain in their arm that doesn't exist. So that's essentially a tactile hallucination. Polyopia, visual multiplication, seeing repetitions of patterns, just one example of many of different kinds of visual hallucinations that people can have. So when a stroke affected people's visual system, there was a Dutch study of 600 elderly patients with visual deficiencies. They found 80% had simple hallucinations, shapes, colors, patterns, while 15% had complex hallucinations, people, animals, scenes. Others hallucinate text, musical notes, numbers, and math symbols. In the phantom limb example, it's an example of a person without any detectable brain injury or disease. It's the limb that's gone. Talking about this woman, she had both simple and complex hallucinations daily for over 6 years, and yet she has managed to maintain a very full life, both domestically and professionally, keeping house, entertaining friends, going out with her husband, and completing a new book. So, again, this is something where you have an example of people who presumably don't have any brain disease. They know they're having hallucinations, and at least in some cases, they can plow through and say, I know I'm having these hallucinations, and I can figure out how to ignore it enough that I can have a normal life. And one more example. Brain scans showed correlation between types of visual hallucinations and area of the visual cortex. So, for example, colored hallucinations activated the cortical areas associated with color construction. Hallucinations of the face associated with the fusiform gyrus, the area responsible for us being able to recognize other people's faces. Text hallucinations reflect hyperactivity in the visual word form area. Intentional visual imagination did not have the same impact to visual cortex as hallucination. People generally know they're hallucinating and visions are not real. They may even enjoy them. So this is just reiterating that theme that I said towards the beginning, where the hallucinations are activating the very same areas of the brain that would be activated if they were normally experiencing color or facial recognition. So it's olfactory hallucinations. People have phantom smells which can result from sinus infections, head injuries, migraines, epilepsy, PTSD, or other conditions. For example, anosmia, sense of smell is completely gone. Some have vivid olfactory hallucinations. Again, the same example, they lost their sensory modality. Parosmia, distortion of perception of an odor. Phantasmia, perception of an odor when no actual odor is present. So for parosmia, where there's a distortion of an odor, this woman testified, tomatoes and oranges started tasting metallic and a bit rotten. Cottage cheese tasted like sour milk. Lettuce began to smell and taste of turpentine. Fish and meat, especially chicken, smelled as if they'd been rotting for a week. That's horrid. You know, our ability to enjoy food and smells is, we take it for granted, but as soon as you lose it, boy, shoots up. There's a big, big problem. So let's look at some other random examples of hallucinations. Sleep paralysis and narcolepsy. Hypnagogic hallucinations are a form of it. Hypnagogic refers to the fact that between going to sleep and falling asleep, there's this interim period, and it's the same when you wake up. There's a sort of groggy time when you wake up, and some people seem to be susceptible to having very vivid and scary hallucinations in these hypnagogic times, in this period. So one person says, sometimes I would see things like huge centipedes or caterpillars crawling all over my ceiling. Once I thought my cat was on the shelf in my room. She seemed to be rolling around and turning into a rat. The worst was when I would hallucinate that a spider was on my chest. I couldn't move. I would try to scream. I am terrified of spiders. Night terrors. It's a special category of nightmares that rises above. We all have nightmares at some point, but this is something that is just completely goes beyond that. Post-encephalitic Parkinson's. It's a very specific type of Parkinson's disease. Oliver Sacks talked about it in one of his books. He observed that L-DOPA treatments cause visual hallucinations in these particular people. Delirium can cause hallucinations from high fevers, infections, organ failure, unmanaged diabetes, and of course delirium tremens. Person described said, I was about 11 in a bed with a high fever when I heard some heavenly music. I understood it to be a choir of angels, even though I found this odd, as I don't believe in heaven or angels, and never have. So I decided it must be coming from Christmas carolers or out or on our front doorstep below. After a minute or so, I realized it was springtime and that I must be hallucinating. Note, the person says, I've never believed in angels or any of that spiritual stuff, and yet her initial interpretation was sort of a Christmas carol thing. This will be another theme that returns. Now we're going to start to get into the things that you are more interested in. Migraines. Why? Well, we'll see in a second. Some of you already know why you're interested in migraines. Scotoma refers to a blind area in the visual field surrounded by a kidney-shaped shimmering. This is a particular migraine that doesn't necessarily involve pain. We think of migraines as a painful headache, but there's a lot of kinds of migraine that don't involve that. Scotoma is a visual kind of hallucination that is fairly common among people who have these. For example, my wife, when she was pregnant, she had a scotoma. And it's presumably because her blood pressure was a little higher, and that caused some pressure maybe in her brain somewhere, but fortunately it went away and wasn't an issue anymore. Migraines can also cause auditory and olfactory hallucinations. Lilliputian hallucinations. It's a very strange thing that there's this particular type of hallucination where everything or certain things seem very small. And this fellow says, I looked down and there they were, a small pink man and his pink ox, perhaps 6 or 7 inches high. They were perfectly made creatures and, except for their color, they looked very real. They didn't speak to me, but they walked around and I watched them with fascination and a kind of amiable tenderness. They stayed around for some minutes and then disappeared. Now again, we're talking about migraines, and we don't always know, or maybe we don't even really know at all, why people have migraines. But a lot of people do, and I would hesitate to say that certainly they don't have mental illness, and do they even have mental disease, brain disease, I should say. Mental lesions, brain lesions. And yet there are these things that are apparently common enough that they're worth describing. Body image distortions, sometimes people have from migraines, and of course, the ones you love, religious experiences. So I'm going to read about a distortion episode. As a child, I had what I called lifting sensations. Every once in a while, I had a powerful internal sensation of being pulled upward, as if my head were rising, even though I knew my feet hadn't left the ground. This lift was accompanied by what can only be called awe, a feeling of transcendence. I variously interpreted these elevations as divine, as in God was calling, or as an amazed connection to things in the world. Everything appeared strange and wondrous. Now it's unclear if this person was a believer in the first place. But certainly she says she was a child, so we don't really know how old she was. But it's sort of combining the body image distortions and the religious experience. which, now, again, it's more than I should presume, perhaps, because we don't know her background. But the experience of the migraine itself, combined with the body distortion, she describes a feeling of awe and transcendence. These are religious kinds of descriptions, or spiritual at least. Maybe religious is a little too far along, but it's a transcendence is what people use to describe spiritual experiences, from migraines in this case. And of course, then there's epilepsy, which is probably what most of you know about is, well, we'll talk about. All right, partial or focal epilepsy without convulsions, similar to hallucinations from similar to hallucinations from migraine, so is often misdiagnosed. So if you have epilepsy without convulsions, which can happen, there are certainly ways that happens, then the doctor doesn't always know. Convulsions is kind of a giveaway, but certainly people can be misdiagnosed between migraines and epilepsy based on hallucinatory experiences like the ones we just talked about for migraines. Sometimes in epilepsy, people have feelings of strangeness, what they call jamais vu, or overfamiliarity, déjà vu. So in a jamais vu, someone says, I looked at everything around me and none of it looked familiar. It was so disorienting, I could not move an inch further. In the same way, I would sometimes not recognize my home, but I knew it was my home. I had learned to be patient and wait for it to pass in 20 or 30 seconds. That would be creepy. Let's see. And of course, religious experiences due to temporal lobe epilepsy. And most of us know about some famous cases of people who we suspect had this kind of epilepsy. For instance, Joan of Arc, St. Paul, right? Isn't it St. Paul that we think had that? And you were... Thank you. Who was she?
She was a nun that she wrote a lot of music, but she also had a lot of experiences of hallucinations and things. She's lived about 500, 600 years.
All right. So those are the more well-known examples. But people continue to have them, and I'll read you another example. He was suddenly overcome with a feeling of bliss. He felt he was literally...
Hallucination that someone was walking across the...
I'm sorry, what?
Something landed on the
Oh.
lens of the thing and walked across.
Oh.
I think. Even you also.
No, yeah, you're crazy. He was suddenly overcome with a feeling of bliss. He felt he was literally in heaven. Afterwards, he was able to recall these experiences, and he continued to believe in their validity. 3 years later, following 3 seizures on successive days, he became elated again. He stated that his mind had cleared. During this episode, he lost his faith. He became an atheist, and it carried the same excitement and revelatory quality as the original religious conversion. And some people have multiple religious conversions because of this particular form of epilepsy. Now, it's not really that common. It's very rare that people have this. But again, there's enough people that do that, and also because of people's interest in religion, it's something that people can talk about, want to talk about. So this person who had multiple religious conversions, I mean, one religion to the next, to the next, to the next. I don't know. Now, another thing about epilepsy, which I think some of you might know about, is in what we call traditional cultures, hunter-gatherers or tribal cultures, the people who become shamans in those cultures tend to be people who have some kind of neurological issues. And in those cultures, when you have epilepsy, sometimes they actually think you're embodied with the spirit, right? So there's a book called The Spirit Catches You When You Fall Down. Has anybody heard of this book? It's a book about the Hmong tribe, which is a tribe from Cambodia that was transplanted into the United States during the Vietnam War, I think, as refugees. A number of them live in the Central Valley of California. And so they're sort of caught between this traditional situation where they actually believe that the epileptics are imbued with the spirit, and so they're revered. And then, they start also being influenced by our modern technology and medicine, someone says, you have epilepsy, and we're going to treat it. And so the book is about the conflict of this traditional culture in the United States versus the modern medicine that they're bumping up against. And they don't like it because they are treating their epileptics as special people, and they're almost afraid that if you treat them, that specialness goes away, and you lose that part of their culture. All right, let's see. All right, so here's, I get ahead of myself here. Dostoevsky, another one. St. Paul, St. Teresa of Avila, Joan of Arc I mentioned. Ecstatic seizures are only in a small minority of these people. Non-religious skeptics have had religious experiences from temporal lobe epilepsy. Ooh, we don't like that. But what it suggests is that there is something perhaps inherent in our brain that makes us susceptible. It isn't like it's just mom and dad and the preacher telling you about religion. That there is something about a tendency to have spiritual experiences that is available in our brain and just needs to be triggered. Atheists don't like that. Yes, sir?
Without no religious experience, never heard of it, you'd still could have a religious experience if you had TLE.
Well, and so what does it mean to have a religious experience? Again, we use the word religion, which is probably a poor word to use. Spiritual. They have spiritual experiences, and I think we'll be talking about perhaps more of what that means. All right. Now, hallucinations is ritual practice. This is where people intentionally want to create hallucinatory experiences. So, again, I mentioned altered states of consciousness and dissociative states. What does that mean? Well, we have lots of words for them. It's always a little difficult to say exactly what that means. Mystical ecstasies, meditation, trance, possession states. Those are common terms for altered states of consciousness. These are universal in traditional societies and nevertheless found in most modern ones, even though we don't, well, I again shouldn't say we. Well, okay, let's just hold that thought. We'll keep going. There was an article on the web not too, go ahead.
What do you mean most modern? What do you mean by the word most?
Well, it's hard to say with any assuredness. I can't say some percentage of modern cultures have it. So, and by the way, what does it mean that a modern culture has it? So we think most people don't go out and attempt to have ritual experiences in our culture. We know of groups of people who might. So, for instance, the people that weird Christian cult that has glossolalia, the speaking in tongues. We think, and again, there are people who say they're faking it. I don't think they're faking it. Let's assume for the moment that they're not faking it. They're having an altered state of consciousness. Certainly, there's this thing called a rave that young people in our culture do, where they go to hear electronic music and they dance up and down for a really long time, and they often take drugs, and they often will claim that they have an altered state of consciousness. And I think that if you actually jump up and down for 3 or 4 or 5 hours, you just might have an altered state of consciousness. Certainly, if you have exhaustion and you have drugs, these things happen. And so again, entheogens, the hallucinogens, we will look in more detail at that, but that happens in this culture. Okay, so again, so I was saying there was an article on the web not too long ago, which was sort of a touchy-feely self-help kind of thing, where this woman was talking about modern mysticism and modern shaman. So there's these people from our culture who go train with shaman in South America or wherever, and then they come back and they act as shaman to rich white people, or that's unfair, but tends to be rich people who can pay for the service of having a shaman explain how you're going to live that mystical lifestyle. And she described one instance where about 7 years ago, when I was in my late 20s, I started hearing voices. I've got to check myself into a mental institution was my first thought, she said, laughing. But before resorting to an asylum, she decided to visit a psychic on the recommendation of a close friend. He opens the door and he goes, "Oh, honey, you're not crazy, you're psychic." And I was like, ooh, well, that explains a few things, but what am I supposed to do with it? So I only bring it up because happens in our culture. Not something that I would put much faith, if I can use that term. I wouldn't put faith in that experience that she had and say that she was psychic. But there are lots of people out there, religious or otherwise, who have this belief in this, well, psychic is how it's described here, but people who believe in the soul and all this other stuff, a lot of the woo that we don't like. But it's part of the culture anyway. So the ritual deprivations. So I mentioned that that's how you get there. So let's look at some of the examples. Fasting, scourging, pain, overstimulation, stress, exhaustion, sensory or sleep deprivation, and our favorite, of course, is drugs. Some examples. I mentioned modern music, dance raves, Sufi twirling around for hours, sacrifice, rites of passage, and the sun dance is one specific one. Does anybody know about the sun dance? Have you heard about this? There was actually a movie called A Man Called Horse from 30 years ago, and it was 40? I can't be that old, can I? But apparently this is a real thing that the North American Native Americans did. They would take pieces of wood and they would attach them to twine, stick it under their pectoral muscles, and then hang themselves. One guy, it's under his pectoral, and the other is in the back. And eventually the skin would rip and they'd fall. I'm willing to bet that they had altered states of consciousness. Why would they do that? Well, we're not going to get into the meaning of this particular tribe, but let's see where we go with this. But it's an example of pain and stress that people do intentionally to get that altered states of consciousness. Okay, so I'm going to read some more examples here. This is about sensory deprivation. After being initially startled, so let's back up a second. They actually did a study, this is, some decades ago, where they first wanted to see what would happen if you created a situation of sensory deprivation to people. And of course, as many of these studies are done, it's done in an academic environment, and you're using undergraduates in Psych 101 or something as the subjects. But they volunteer, of course. So this is how they describe it. After being initially startled, the subjects tended to find their hallucinations amusing, interesting, and sometimes irritating, but without any meaning. The hallucinations seemed external, proceeding autonomously with little relevance or reference to the individual or situation. So the point is, after a certain amount of time of sensory deprivation, the brain is going to want the stimulation. Just like if you've actually lost the sensory ability in the brain due to lesions, here again, you don't have any damage, but the brain is saying, I need to see, I need visual experience, I need auditory experience. And so it starts creating it spontaneously after a certain amount of time.
Man Called Horse, 1970.
Thank you. That's, oh my God, that's a long time ago. Rites of passage. Again, we sort of heard in again, traditional tribes that rites of passage can be very brutal. And so I'm going to read you an example of one that is certainly that. The initiates are taken to a special smokehouse tent where the torment begins. For 4 days, the initiates are blindfolded and subject to kinetic stimulation, lifted up and dropped, carried around and whirled about. And acoustic stimulation, which is done by loud, rapid drumming, rattling, singing, and howling. This process is repeated 4 times until the initiate is weak, pale, rigid, and appears lifeless on the ground. The initiates must lie still, cannot talk or move, and have to fast, although they are teased and tested by the men holding tasty bits of salmon close to their mouths. The next phase is physical endurance, in which the poor souls swim in icy waters, run long distances barefoot, sometimes in snow, and dance endlessly to the drum, which drives them into an altered state receptive to witnessing the appearance of a guardian spirit in a dream or vision. Now, I said that all traditional cultures have altered states of consciousness, usually with hallucinations. And so this is just one example of what they do to the adolescent boys. They do these things to the girls too in some cultures, or sometimes they just sit them in the menstrual hut and they just don't do anything. But that's a different story. The point is, this is something that you can achieve with various ways. And some cultures intentionally do this. And of course, it says they are going to see their guardian spirit. So it's not random. I mean, they're saying, they're feeding them, they're guiding them. You're going to see your guardian spirit. But the fact is, in order to really see that, you need to really lose your, what we call quotidian consciousness, your day-to-day consciousness, and get out of your head into this altered state.
Kind of reminds me of peyote.
Well, we're going to talk about something like that. And I'm glad you brought it up. Maybe you can testify later. Oh, psychedelics, transcendence on demand. Okay. Almost every culture ingests compounds to alter consciousness, mostly for ritual, magic, or sacrament. I'm going to go out on a limb here and say, because of the way that psychedelics and other drugs are used in this culture, we are using them wrong. Am I saying we should use them for this purpose? If you're going to do it, yes. If you're going to alter your consciousness with drugs, you should do it in this format, in this context. Not because you're running away or hiding or you're all the other reasons that happen, because that's bad. I mean, you know, I'm not suggesting that it's a good thing to do, but people do it. And the people have done it for tens of thousands of years for this reason, which suggests maybe that there's a reason to do that. Oh, yeah. So I have, let's see, where do we want to do this? Let's try, okay. Altered states of consciousness frequently include hallucinations. Is perception of gods or other spirits or ancestors a hallucination? Well, we tend to think that it is. But the point is, they frequently do have these perceptions when they frequently have altered states of consciousness, which they frequently want to do. How do ritually achieved altered states of consciousness, spontaneous mystical experiences, and pathological hallucinatory states compare? Is the feeling of transcendence or mystical enlightenment a hallucination? Well, let's say it is. That's what we tend to think, right? But even if it is, does that mean it's a bad thing or a wrong thing? When people have been doing this for tens of thousands of years. Are the tribes wrong? You know, it's one thing for us atheists, and I am one, to criticize people's religious experiences, but we also tend to be a lot more broad-minded about tribal cultures. We don't tend to criticize them. We try. It's just, I'm not saying it's good or bad, it's just a habit that I noticed that my peers tend to have, where we give them a little more latitude about their traditions and culture. We don't criticize them like we criticize theists in our modern culture. So, in any case, you know, do we think that when they do these things, is it a hallucination? And if it is it a bad thing? Well, we can have that discussion. So, I think someone was asking, I don't know if it was here, oh, you know where it was? It was in the earlier talk today that I gave for the Oasis group. They wanted to know about if people are looking into the biology of hallucinations now. And I'm going to show some examples kind of historically back in the 60s, but it's revived. It's coming back. So we now have a conference called the Psychedelic Science Conference that is going on, and the people who are researching the effects of psychedelics and other altered states of consciousness issues, they all get together in their academic conference. This was in Oakland in April. But there's one in Seattle. I think it's a different group. There's at least 2 different groups doing this. So it's suddenly becoming a thing that's, they're trying to make it okay. Of course, we live in this Puritan society, and
Just hasn't found out yet.
well, he's picking his battles, I suppose. But yes, at least for the moment. Well, and they're doing it through the academic community. So they're somewhat protected, not totally, but they have academic freedom. So if they're going to pursue these kinds of studies, it's a little hard to go in there and say you can't do it, even though certainly people try. You can't restrict academic freedom. So okay, go for it. They're getting away with it at the moment. So there's a particular tribe in the South American rainforest called the Yanomamo. Maybe some of you, who knows the Yanomamo? Yeah, oh, most of you, okay, a lot of you. And they have a ritual where they create this compound out of a couple or three different plants in their jungle, and they process it, and then one guy it's a tube out of a reed or something, and he blows it up the nose of the other guy. And then they go on their journey. This stuff is very powerful hallucinogen. And what I'm going to try and do now is play a YouTube video. Let's see how this works out, of an example of this happening. Oh, I have to open up the app, sorry. Didn't have it open. Let's see where we're going here. See if I can find it. Oh, I don't have internet. Never mind. Sorry. I teased you, and I can't come through. I didn't think about that.
There is internet Wi-Fi with the library.
Yeah, I'm sure there is. Well, maybe we don't need a password.
No, do not need a password.
Okay, Austin Public Library. Let's go there. Anyway, so what did I do? Come on. All right. Let's see if it's hopefully in my history here. No, I have to talk about all this other stuff. It's, let's see, history, restore. Dang it, not the one. All right, I'm just going to go to YouTube and I'll find it. I can find it pretty fast. If I can type. Here it is. Is this the one? Let's hope. It's a gamble, but we'll try. Yes, it is. All right. So we'll watch about half of it, I guess. So there's audio, but it's mostly some guy who's just describing it. The only thing you'll be missing on the audio is the sounds that they make, and you'll see, and I'll help you when he makes those sounds. So here they are. They're not using the tube in this case. Oh, I'm sorry. You can't even see it. Duh. Let's try it again. I have to change this to mirroring, I guess. All right, let's roll it back to about here. Okay, now we're in business. So they don't use the tube. They just take it out of their little bucket and they stick it in their nose. The effect is the same. So they talk about how they're going to see their spirit guide. And here this guy, he's making these noises. He's going, this guy's chanting. That's the stuff, whatever it is. And this guy, this is where we think he's really trying to be the spirit guide. He's being the animal that they're trying to achieve. So he's going to do I'm the animal, and he's going to be the animal. That's what he's doing right now. Okay, that's the stuff that I cared about. All right, we can kill that. Let's go back to here. All right, back to this. All right. All right, now we're back in business. Characteristics of mystical states of mind. Oh, there you are. Thank you. So at the very beginning, I said I'm a little hesitant to talk about biology, or at least, in this case, the biology of hallucinations. And this is where it gets a little dicey. Yeah, biology of hallucinations. So we saw kind of biology. It was fairly biological. But here, characteristics of a mystical state of mind. We're going to look at some of the descriptions that they give for that. I wouldn't call it biology, but you've got to start somewhere. People have unifying visions, the abstract idea that all is one, oneness. Concrete apprehension of the one as being the inner subjectivity in all things, described variously as life, consciousness, or living presence. Sense of objectivity, insightful illumination, and the authoritativeness of an ultimate reality. Transcendence of time and space, related to a sense of oneness. Feelings of blessedness, joy, happiness, satisfaction. Feeling of the holy, sacredness, or divine experience of God. Paradoxicality. Someone would say, I was completely myself and yet connected to everything in the moment and yet eternal. That's the paradox. Ineffability, incapable of being described in words. The reason I bring this up, first of all, you can see there's no science there. It's just people's interpretation. But we're going to now look at some experiments that were done in the 60s where they gave people psilocybin in a controlled, so-called controlled situation. But they had, in order to do this, first they have to, know who the people are. They had to give these people a survey and questionnaires and say, what's your background? It turns out they decided to choose mostly white Protestants who were students. What else did they do? Oh, well, and they said, have you ever had a psychedelic experience in the past? Have you ever had a spiritual experience in the past? So they're trying to just get a group of people who all share the basic same traits to eliminate all the various variabilities. And they had to figure out what constitutes a mystical state of mind, because if people have mystical states of mind, taking psilocybin, and have these experiences, they need to compare it to something. So this is the list that they came up with, or variations of this list, to describe, people are going to be having the experience of the drug, and they're going to describe what the experience is. So this is what they use as a basis against it. The experiment was called the Good Friday experiment because it was done on Good Friday. It was done in 1962 in the basement of the Marsh Chapel on the campus of Boston University. As part of the control, they gave half the people the psilocybin and half the people a dose of niacin, vitamin B12. It's one of the vitamins. What is it? 6, thank you. Niacin, if you take enough, causes flushing and sweating and increases your heart rate a little bit. They're trying to fool you into wondering if you've actually taken the drug or not. But it became obvious very quickly who was on the psilocybin and who wasn't. So that part of the control wasn't very good. And we'll look at some of the results. The aftermath was people were not particularly happy with the methodology of the study. So we have to keep it in mind that there's issues with it. So the purpose is to compare typology of mystical consciousness to entheogenic or psychedelic episodes. And this is the typology that we saw in the previous slide of the mystical conscious types. 20 grad student volunteers received either 30 milligrams of psilocybin or 200 milligrams of niacin. Ooh, it says B3. Could that be wrong? In any case, it's a vitamin. All right. Thank you. Checking that really fast on the old internet. As a control, so it also causes dizziness, warmth, and tingling. Post-experiment recorded interviews and questionnaires. Right after the study, they did the interviews and questionnaires, and then they repeated it 6 months later and said, what was your experience? And this is what they found. So Griffiths was, okay, so actually I'm not going to tell you what they found. In 2006, this guy Griffiths, who is affiliated with that big medical place, Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, he's protected by his academic freedom at Johns Hopkins. He was able to repeat, and they tried to improve the controls. And I think what they did is they isolated people so they couldn't see what other people were experiencing. Better controls, he got similar results. These are the results of the Good Friday replication from 2006. So what's this telling us? On the bottom axis are some of the mystical consciousness typologies. Unity, there's internal unity, external unity, sacredness. It's a little different than what I described. Intuitive knowledge, transcendence, positive mood, and ineffability. But this is how they did it at that time in that study. In green is the psilocybin folks. Oh, and in this case, they went back 14 months later and re-interviewed them and said, how would you rate their feeling of sacredness? How would you rate your feeling of transcendence? And so for the people who took psilocybin and then their feelings 14 months later were virtually the same and very high, in the 70 to 80% had strong feelings related to these. The people who did the placebo in red were in the 20 to 35%, maybe 40 in the positive mood. Although that's striking to me. If you just take a placebo, which is nothing, how would you have any sacred experience? Which is kind of makes me wonder about, again, the methodology, but there's still a difference enough that it's telling us that the fact is you take psilocybin and you will have these feelings, emotions. Here's a different slide from that same study, and it just gives us a different perspective on what they're experiencing. So in this case, the control was methylphenidate, and I'm not sure what that is or what it does. But the psilocybin's in black. And so they're asking the question, how personally meaningful is this experience? And they're asking this 2 months after the session. The black says, the first one says, it's the single most important experience of my life. Among the top 5 most important experiences of my life. So it's very clear that the majority of people who took the psilocybin, this was a deeply moving and important experience to them compared to the controls, who are more spread out, but certainly it's not that important. The biggest lines for the controls, once a month, once a week. So the experience was not that big a deal compared to those who took psilocybin. Why is this important? Well, it suggests, again, that these psychedelic experiences and the hallucinations that they might have had, it suggests to me that there's something inherent in these people, in our brains. These people, all people, have the ability to have spiritual experiences. Call them hallucinations if you'd like. But we have the propensity to go there if stimulated properly. About 85% of the psilocybin consumers said the undertaking rated as one of the most meaningful experiences of their lives. Okay, I said that. Ritual experience and function. Perceptions of gods and mystical sensations are hallucinations, but the feelings are real. These behaviors are too ubiquitous to persist accidentally. A function of ritual, and this is just ritual. This is not about hallucinations. or altered states of consciousness. Pascal Boyer, some of you know if you've read some theories of religion, and his colleague Pierre Leonard, both are at University of Washington in St. Louis. They say a function of ritual is to swamp working memory and permit the temporary suppression of intrusive thoughts. When we say swamping working memory is where our day-to-day activity happens. It's where short-term memory and sensory input and decisions and thinking all come together and motivate us to live our lives day to day. And they're saying rituals swamp or inhibit or suppress working memory, which is really strange, because if working memory is really where it's all happening in our brain, in our day-to-day life, why would you want to do that? Why would you seek out ritual? Why would you seek out to do this, as people do? Andrew Newberg is a neuroscientist at the University of Pennsylvania who is well known for doing brain scans of praying nuns and meditating Buddhists. And he found, did I talk about how, if I repeat myself, please let me know. So when he did the study, he found that praying nuns, meditating Buddhists, there's an area of the brain called the orientation association area, which I think is in the same area as the temporal lobe epilepsy. It's in the temporal parietal junction, which is the temporal lobe is on here, parietal is along the top, and the junction area is this particular area. And he found that when they meditate and when they pray, and these are seriously praying nuns, I mean, they're way past the common prayer people, this area of the brain was inhibited. And that area of the brain is responsible for our perception of ourself in space, which is really interesting, because let's imagine that if you inhibit your sense of self in space, you now might describe your feelings as having a feeling of oneness with everything, a connectedness with everything, the spiritual experience. Andrew Newberg has written several books about religion and belief, and one of those books, he says, the mystical experiences of our subjects, the altered states of mind they described as the absorption of the self into something larger, were not the result of emotional mistakes or simple wishful thinking, but were associated instead with a series of observable neurological events, which, while unusual, are not outside the range of normal brain function. In other words, mystical experience is biologically, observably, and scientifically real. That's my book. That's the cover. Now, we're going to sort of link it into my talk tomorrow night, although I'll explain that I'm not going to talk about all this stuff. But the summation is religious rituals are behaviors that temporarily suppress consciousness in part by stimulating emotions, swamping working memory, and through altered states of consciousness. These rituals are adaptive, and we are genetically predisposed to engage in them. The problem for atheists is that we like to believe that religion is going to go away as people become more familiar with science and rationality. I'm sorry to tell you, it ain't that way. So tomorrow night, talking to CFI, I'm going to talk more about consciousness, not about ritual so much or altered states of consciousness, but it was a way to sort of work the hallucinations in that direction, because that's what we care about. When we think of hallucinations, it tends to be in terms of how that affects people's religious or spiritual behavior, and we like to think that that can go away. Thank you very much.